Have you ever stopped to think about what really happens when we manage to see beyond the stories our society tells? When we realize that the grand narratives organizing our lives are, in essence, human constructions? There is something profoundly unsettling in this awakening, a nearly physical sensation of vertigo, as if the ground beneath our feet suddenly turned into quicksand. Many of us experience fleeting moments of this clarity, usually late at night, when the distractions of the day fade and we are left alone with our thoughts. In these moments, we may briefly sense that the structures giving meaning to our existence are more fragile than we'd like to admit, but we quickly suppress this feeling. We return to the safety of our routines, our established beliefs, our tangible goals. And perhaps that's wise, because there is a genuine danger in seeing too far beyond the narrative. This is the paradox I want to explore today. Why truth, which we so highly value as an ideal, can become a threat when applied to the very structures that sustain our collective sanity. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived in small hunter-gatherer groups where shared narratives rarely extended beyond the immediate tribe and known territory. Stories were local, orally transmitted, and adapted to the group's immediate needs. When humans began forming larger societies, roughly 12,000 years ago, with the advent of the agricultural revolution, a new and unprecedented challenge arose: how to coordinate the actions and beliefs of thousands or eventually millions of individuals who would never meet in person. The answer was the creation of grand narratives. Shared myths about gods, nations, money, laws, and institutions. These weren't mere stories for entertainment, but the very foundations that made large-scale cooperation possible. Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari calls these constructions imagined orders and identifies a crucial characteristic. For them to function effectively, people must forget that they are imagined. Money works because everyone believes it does. Laws are respected because people believe in their authority. Nations inspire sacrifice because citizens believe in their reality. The power of these narratives depends on their perception as natural, eternal, divine, or at least inevitable truths. The moment we start to see them as contingent human constructions, they begin to lose their power over us. This is not a new observation. In ancient Greece, Plato already expressed concern about how certain truths could destabilize society. In his ideal republic, he defended what he called the noble lie, a founding myth that would justify the hierarchical social structure of his utopia. Plato recognized something deeply counterintuitive: that some forms of collective illusion may be necessary for social stability. He saw this not as cynicism, but as practical necessity. A society without unifying myths would be incapable of inspiring loyalty, sacrifice, and cooperation among strangers. In the centuries that followed, the forms of these narratives changed, but their function remained similar. Organized religions provided comprehensive cosmologies, placing human existence within a larger divine plan. Nation-states created collective identities based on stories of shared pasts and common destinies. Political ideologies offered visions of ideal social organization and paths to achieve it. All these constructions, though different in content, share the same structural function: to create meaning and cohesion on a social scale. Entering modernity, particularly with the Enlightenment, we saw a fascinating new development. Skepticism toward traditional narratives, especially religious ones, became itself a dominant narrative. The pursuit of objective truth, separated from tradition and superstition, became a fundamental value. But there was an internal tension in this project. If we applied the same skeptical scrutiny to the very values of the Enlightenment, or to notions of progress, reason, and individual autonomy, what would remain? Philosopher Nietzsche saw this contradiction. His famous declaration that God is dead was not merely a rejection of religion, but an anguished recognition that the foundations of Western moral certainty were crumbling. When Nietzsche said that there are no facts, only interpretations, he wasn't advocating simplistic relativism, but acknowledging a disturbing truth. Even our most basic notions of truth and meaning are built within specific narrative structures. And if those structures disintegrate, what remains? This is the vertigo of nihilism that so haunted him. It's not that truth doesn't exist, but that raw truth, stripped of human meaning, may be unbearable or at the very least insufficient for living a fully human life. In the 20th century, these questions were explored in even more radical ways. Thinkers like Michel Foucault examined how dominant narratives are inseparable from systems of power, while Jean Baudrillard suggested that we have entered an age of simulacra, where representations of reality have become more important than reality itself. Postmodern theory, in its many forms, took this narrative skepticism to the extreme, questioning every claim to universal or objective truth. For many, this deconstructive impulse represented liberation. By recognizing the constructed nature of all narratives, we could free ourselves from oppressive systems, creating new stories that were more inclusive and just. But others saw danger in this approach. If every narrative is equally a construction, if there is no firm ground for distinguishing between more or less truthful narratives, how do we avoid falling into paralyzing relativism? How do we preserve the social cohesion necessary to face collective challenges? This tension has intensified dramatically with the advent of the digital age. The internet, especially social media, has created an unprecedented environment for the proliferation and fragmentation of narratives. The initial promise was democratic. More voices, more perspectives, a freer flow of information. But the result has often been chaos. Algorithms designed to maximize engagement favor emotionally charged content, conspiracy theories, and all kinds of tribalism. We see the emergence of what some call epistemic bubbles, where people inhabit completely different informational realities. Italian philosopher Umberto Eco once observed that the internet has given voice to legions of idiots who previously only spoke at the bar after a glass of wine without harming the community. This provocative remark captures something important about the risks of radical narrative democratization. When every voice seems equally legitimate, regardless of expertise, method, or evidence, how do we distinguish between reliable information and misinformation? How do we maintain a shared sense of reality that allows for collective deliberation and coordinated action? Now we reach the core of our paradox. On one hand, the ability to see beyond dominant narratives, to recognize their contingent and constructed nature, is crucial for social progress, for correcting historical injustices, for adapting to new challenges. On the other hand, if we take this deconstruction too far, we risk undermining the very foundations of collective meaning and social cooperation. Finding the balance between these opposing forces may be the ultimate challenge of our era. Let's consider a few concrete examples of this dilemma. Take the case of national identity. Historians have long shown that nations are imagined communities, constructed through specific historical processes, often involving simplifications, myths, and even deliberate distortions. Recognizing this can be important for confronting exclusionary or aggressive nationalisms. But if every national identity is reduced to a mere fabrication, what motivates the sacrifice required for shared civic projects? How do we maintain the solidarity necessary to sustain democratic institutions or welfare systems? Or consider money. Economically educated people know that money is ultimately a shared fiction. Paper notes and digits in bank accounts have value only because we collectively agree they do. In times of crisis, like hyperinflation or currency collapse, this fictional nature becomes painfully apparent. Yet, our entire global economy absolutely depends on this shared fiction. If everyone simultaneously stopped believing in the value of money, the result would be catastrophic collapse, affecting even the most basic needs like food and shelter. I need to pause for a moment and ask you directly, which aspect of this future we're discussing most awakens your fear or apprehension? Do you lie awake at night thinking about it too? I know that we often keep these concerns to ourselves, perhaps out of fear of sounding paranoid or technophobic in a world that celebrates every new innovation without question. But your anxieties are valid and probably shared by more people than you think. Share in the comments. My greatest fear about our fragmented narrative future is your voice might help create a space where we can honestly discuss these collective fears instead of suppressing them. And perhaps by naming these fears together, we can begin to imagine ways to face them. Or let us think about social institutions, marriage, private property, formal education, legal systems. All are social constructs that could, in theory, be organized in radically different ways. Anthropologists and historians have documented the immense diversity of human arrangements across time and space. This insight can be liberating, opening possibilities for reform and social reimagination, but it can also be paralyzing. If everything is constructed and contingent, how do we decide which structures to preserve, reform, or abandon? How do we avoid social chaos during periods of radical transition? Religion perhaps offers the clearest example of this paradox. For the devout believer, religion provides a comprehensive system of meaning, clear moral values, existential comfort, and often a supportive community. The secular perspective, which views religions as human, historical constructions, can challenge these benefits. But even atheist thinkers, such as Alain de Botton, recognize that religions evolve to meet deep human needs that do not simply vanish when theological belief is abandoned. How do we create meaning, community, and comfort in a post-religious world? This question remains unsatisfactorily answered for many. Science fiction offers fascinating explorations of this dilemma. In the film The Matrix, humans are presented with a choice: the blue pill of comfortable ignorance or the red pill of painful truth. The film clearly privileges the red pill, the pursuit of truth at any cost. But what if the issue is more complicated? What if certain illusions are necessary for psychological health or social cooperation? What happens if everyone takes the red pill at once? This brings us to one of the oldest and most persistent philosophical questions. What is the value of truth? Why do we seek knowledge? In the Western tradition, we often assume that truth is an intrinsic good, that more knowledge is always better than less. But this assumption deserves closer examination. As Nietzsche asked, why truth? Why not untruth, or uncertainty, or even ignorance? This is not a defense of lies or manipulation, but a recognition that the relationship between truth and human well-being may be more complicated than our post-Enlightenment culture generally admits. Certain forms of knowledge can come with significant psychological and social costs. The ability to see beyond narratives can be both liberating and alienating. The psychologist Ernest Becker, in his book The Denial of Death, argued that much of human culture functions as an immortality project, an elaborate denial of our inevitable mortality. Religions promise life after death. Secular cultures offer symbolic immortality through achievements, fame, descendants, or identification with projects larger than individual life. By exposing these mechanisms as psychological coping strategies, are we truly helping people? Or are we undermining systems that evolved precisely to protect us from truths that might be psychologically unbearable? Perhaps most disturbing is recognizing that none of us is immune to this dilemma. Even those who pride themselves on skepticism, rationality, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths depend on narratives to make sense of existence. The idea that we can stand completely outside of narratives, view them objectively from some privileged point beyond culture, is itself an illusion. We are always within some story, even if it is the story of escaping stories. The question then is not whether we should embrace or reject narratives, but which narratives we choose, with what degree of awareness and for what purposes. How do we navigate between the twin poles of blind dogmatism and paralyzing nihilism? How do we maintain narratives robust enough to sustain meaning and cooperation, yet open to revision, growth, and adaptation? Consider how different societies have faced this challenge. Japan, for example, has maintained a fascinating balance between rapid modernization and the preservation of cultural traditions. To what extent does this reflect a more sophisticated approach to collective narratives? Or think of how post-colonial nations struggle to build national identities that acknowledge traumatic histories while still inspiring hope and unity. What lessons can we learn from these ongoing social experiments? Scandinavia offers another interesting example. These are highly secular societies that still maintain exceptional levels of social trust, cooperation, and well-being. What narratives have replaced traditional religion in these contexts? How do they sustain meaning and solidarity without resorting to transcendent founding myths? Returning to digital technology, we see how it intensifies this dilemma. On one hand, the internet has democratized access to information, allowing previously suppressed truths to surface and challenge official narratives. On the other, it has created an environment where false narratives spread as quickly as true ones, where algorithms optimized for engagement favor divisive, polarizing content. Political philosopher Michael Sandel argues that we have lost the art of civil discourse precisely because we avoid substantive engagement with questions of value and meaning. By trying to build politics purely on individual rights and economic efficiency, he says, we create a vacuum easily filled by populism, tribalism, and fundamentalism. Perhaps the solution is not less engagement with meaning-laden narratives, but more, though, in a more reflective and open form. Evolutionary biology offers a helpful perspective here. As a species, we evolved as storytellers. Our capacity to create and believe in shared fictions is not a design flaw, but a crucial adaptation that enabled large-scale cooperation. Anthropologist and evolutionary theorist Joseph Henrich argues that this ability for cumulative cultural transmission, including shared narratives, is what sets us apart from other intelligent species. This suggests that abandoning shared narratives entirely is not only undesirable, but possibly impossible for creatures like us. If we accept this, the question becomes, how do we make the best use of this evolutionary trait? How do we create and maintain narratives that are simultaneously inspiring and flexible, unifying and inclusive, meaningful and adaptable? A promising approach comes from German philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer and his concept of the fusion of horizons. Gadamer argued that genuine understanding does not come from completely escaping our own cultural perspective, which is impossible, but from engaging respectfully with other perspectives in ways that expand our own interpretive horizon. This suggests a relationship to narratives that is neither uncritical acceptance nor total rejection, but continuous dialogical engagement. Another useful model comes from psychologist and philosopher William James and his pragmatism. James suggested judging ideas not merely by their abstract truth, but by their practical consequences for human life. Some narratives, even if not literally true in an absolute sense, can be true enough if they lead to richer, more meaningful, more connected lives. This pragmatic approach avoids both dogmatism and nihilism. Writer Rebecca Solnit offers another valuable perspective. In her book, Hope in the Dark, she argues for a form of hope that depends neither on certainty nor on naive optimism. Hope, Solnit suggests, is the embrace of the uncertainty of human history, recognizing both its tragedies and its surprising openings. This form of hope may be a model for how to inhabit narratives provisionally, committedly, but not dogmatically. This brings us back to our initial paradox. The danger of seeing beyond the narrative is not that truth is inherently harmful, but that certain kinds of truth, approached in certain ways, can undermine the very structures that sustain meaning and human cooperation. The solution is neither blind acceptance of traditional narratives nor their radical rejection, but a more mature, reflective relationship with our shared stories. What does this mean in practice? For individuals, it suggests an attitude of humble curiosity. We can critically examine the narratives we inherit, question their assumptions, recognize their limitations, yet still appreciate their value and function. We can hold our dearest beliefs with what philosopher Richard Rorty called irony, an acknowledgement of their contingency and limitation, that does not diminish their power in our lives. For communities and societies, it suggests the need for spaces where different narratives can be explored, debated, and revised in a spirit of mutual respect. It means creating what sociologist Jürgen Habermas called the ideal speech situation, conditions in which different voices can truly be heard, where arguments are evaluated on their merits rather than on the power of those who advance them. For educators, it suggests the importance of teaching not only content, but metacognition, the ability to think about our own thinking. To recognize our own narrative assumptions, we need to form people who can inhabit narratives consciously, who can be both committed and critical, grounded and reflective. For leaders and communicators, it suggests the responsibility to craft narratives that are inspiring without being manipulative, that unite without homogenizing, that offer meaning without demanding blind dogmatism. We need fewer narratives that simplify complexity into heroes and villains, and more that honor the true complexity of human experience. Perhaps the greatest challenge is to develop what philosopher Paul Ricoeur called second naivete, a relationship with myths and symbols that comes after critique, not before it. It is the ability to find meaning in narratives even while recognizing their constructed nature. It is like the adult who can appreciate a fairy tale on a different level than a child, seeing in it truths that transcend the question of literalness. To conclude, I would like to return to the image of vertigo with which I began. When we see beyond the narratives that structure our reality, we may momentarily feel as if the ground has vanished beneath our feet. But perhaps the problem is not the absence of solid ground, but our expectation that it should exist. Perhaps the human condition is precisely this: to create meaning in a universe that offers none inherently, to tell stories knowing they are our creations, not discoveries. Philosopher Albert Camus captured this beautifully in his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. Confronted with the apparent absurdity of the human condition, Camus advocated neither despair nor retreat into illusory comforts. Instead, he imagined Sisyphus condemned to eternally push a boulder up a hill, only to watch it roll back down as happy in his task. The struggle itself toward the heights, Camus wrote, is enough to fill a man's heart. Perhaps there is a similar lesson for us. The struggle to create and sustain meaningful narratives, even while aware of their fragility and contingency, is not a tragic flaw or a necessary compromise, but the very heart of the human condition. It is what makes us human. Seeing beyond the narrative need not lead to despair or nihilism if we accept that the meaning we create, though not eternal or absolute, is still real in its consequences and worthy of our care and commitment. If these reflections have touched on something you've been feeling but perhaps have not found the words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you will join a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we gather here to explore together the great questions that define our era and to seek not only understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing. This is not just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth. Join us on this ongoing journey. Subscribe so that we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with greater wisdom and purpose in a world that so often leaves us disoriented and divided.
The key problem about the world is not evil, it's ignorance, it's delusion.
When you read Nexus, you say humans are smart but also stupid and self-destructive. So it almost like puts you down a bit.
Humans think that with all our technological development, especially in the field of information technology, we will be freed, liberated from ignorance and delusion. And it's not happening. In the monotheistic religions like Christianity and Islam, there is a belief in evil. But in Hinduism and Buddhism, the main idea is that the problem is usually ignorance and delusion. People sometimes think that AI maybe will tell us the truth about the world. Again, it's unlikely to happen. The danger is that AI will entrap us, imprison us within a web of delusions even worse than anything we have seen before in history.
Wars of conquest, which were taboo since 1945, are coming back. The relatively stable liberal order of the early 21st century is collapsing. Instead of a cooperative order based on universal values, global institutions, and international laws, we are entering into a super competitive, chaotic world in which only one thing matters, and this one thing is brute force. Leaders like President Trump envision the world as a collection of fortresses, with each country separated from the others by high walls. Financial walls like tariffs, military walls, cultural walls, and physical walls. This vision may have certain advantages, but it fails to address one key problem. Walled fortresses are seldom friendly. Thousands of years of history teach us that each national fortress would probably want a bit more security, prosperity, and territory for itself at the expense of the neighbors. And in the absence of universal values, global institutions, and international laws, how would rival fortresses resolve their disputes? For millennia, the vision of the world as a collection of fortresses always led to exactly the same outcome: a never-ending cycle of wars, with powerful empires conquering their weaker neighbors and eventually fighting each other for supremacy. This is already beginning to happen all around us. Wars of conquest, which were taboo since 1945, are coming back.
I could get an AI to tell me that it feels pain, it's sad.
That's a big problem because there is a huge incentive to train AIs to pretend to be alive. In truth, because we don't understand consciousness, we don't have any proof, even that other humans have feelings. I feel my own feelings, but I never feel your feelings. I only assume that you're also a conscious being. Society grants a status of a conscious entity to not only to humans, but also to some animals, not based on any scientific proof, but based on social convention. Like most people feel that their dogs are conscious, so society accepts, most societies, that dogs are sentient beings and they have some rights. Even if AI has no feelings, no consciousness, no sentience whatsoever, but it becomes very good at pretending to have feelings. This will become a social convention. People will feel that their AI friend is a conscious being and therefore should be granted rights.